Welcome, everyone. My name is Malia Brink, and I serve as Counsel for Indigent Defense to the ABA Standing Committee on Legal Aid and Indigent Defense. I'm going to be your host today. We are thrilled to be presenting a timely webinar entitled Racial Disparities in Criminal Justice, a conversation with Chief Justice Cheri Beasley and Ted Shaw. This webinar is sponsored by the ABA section on Civil Rights and Social Justice, as well as the Standing Committee on Legal Aid and Indigent Defense. This panel is one of many in a series commemorating Black History Month. We're actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so please keep up with americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on these programs. I also would like to thank Melanie Bates Consulting for their generous support of this event and other programs in our Black History Month series. During today's program, I'm going to encourage you to ask questions of our panelists through the Q&A function, not the chat function. If you don't see the Q&A in your controls, just make sure that your screen is not idle, sometimes under more, and we'll address these questions at the end of our panel. We'll be sharing a recording of this program with everyone who's registered so that you can share it widely with your networks. And with that, I am thrilled to be part of today's program, Racial Disparities and Criminal Justice. Our panelists today are Chief Justice Cheri Beasley. She's currently a partner at McGuire Woods. She was the first African-American woman in the North Carolina Supreme Court's 200-year history to serve as Chief Justice. She served on the state's highest court from 2012 to 2021 and was named Chief Justice in March of 2019. During her time as Chief, she initiated a number of reforms to improve efficiency, fairness, and accessibility of the state's court system, as well as launching a number of initiatives, including North Carolina's Faith and Justice Alliance, bringing together legal and religious leaders to address the legal needs of low-income residents. Chief Justice Beasley also served as judge on North Carolina's Court of Appeals and the District Court. And before beginning her judicial career, very importantly to me, Beasley was a public defender in Cumberland County. And I would also like to introduce Ted Shaw. Mr. Shaw currently serves as the Julius L. Chambers Distinguished Professor of Law and Director for the Center of Civil Rights at UNC School of Law. He spent more than 25 years as an attorney with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, serving as LDF's 5th Director Counsel. Shaw argued a number of cases before the US Supreme Court, including a landmark case as lead counsel representing African-American and Latino students at the University of Michigan. It was the undergraduate affirmative action case in 2003, Gratz versus Bollinger. And candidly, he is a recipient of too many awards and honorary degrees to mention. So, well, technically I'm moderating this panel. My goal was really to set up a conversation between these two people and kind of sit back and watch. With that in mind, I'm just going to ask a couple of questions to sort of set the table, and then we can see where the discussion takes you all. And I want to start with the kind of moment that we're in, which I think is a very interesting moment. We've just seen the conclusion of the presidency of Donald Trump with all of its racial divisiveness. I refuse to say dog whistles because I heard them, and I don't need to insult anyone. Many people see his entire presidency as a backlash to the election of President Obama, America's first Black president. Both Trump's presidency and the pandemic seem to have heightened awareness of racial disparities that persist in this country. So before we get into more specific topics, I'm wondering for each of you how you're thinking about this moment. Mr. Shaw, can I start with you?
Sure, you can. Let me say it's an honor to be here with Chief Justice Beasley, and I've known her for quite some time now, but I always treasure the opportunities to collaborate with her one way or another. The moment we're in, this has been, it's a cliche, this has been a Dickensian moment. It's been the best of times and the worst of times. I am, for one, grateful for the fact that we've come out of the moment that we were in over the last 4 years. in which I think American democracy has been very much in peril. And I'm not saying that we can be sanguine now about where we are.
Mm-hmm.
It's a better moment than where we were just a few months ago. Having said that, the attack on the assault on the Capitol, the ways in which racism is open, undisguised, and virulent, that's very troubling. I'm very troubled by those who seem to have abandoned their belief in our norms and the norms of democracy. And yet, I think this is a moment in which we have to find reason for hope. And I am hopeful. I do think that there are those who are very much committed to the restoration of the norms of democracy, and who are committed to the rule of law. And I think that some of our institutions, like the Justice Department, can be restored. In spite of the fact that, in my view, there were two seats, really talk about something that was stolen, on the Supreme Court, that should have gone in another direction. The courts have, in many respects, at least so far, upheld some of the most important elements of our democracy and our Constitution so far. And so we'll have to see what happens. So it's a complex time. And I'm also conscious that I'm at a point in my life where I'm really looking to younger people to take the baton and to run their part of the race.
Justice Beasley?
I too would like to thank the American Bar Association and the aforementioned sections for hosting this gathering. And I am so honored to be here with Professor Shaw, who really is the epitome of scholarship in thinking about and in truly being a part of the justice system, which affords people the rights. I mean, often that's where the fights are, is in our courts for true justice. And he really is just a real statesman. And so I appreciate him in all ways, and certainly appreciate you, Malia, and I'm glad to be here today. I am deeply moved by this moment. On February the 14th, I had a birthday. And I agree with Professor Shaw that this moment with the insurgents, really on the heels of a pandemic that we've experienced for a year, where people really are suffering and our institutions are really grappling with how to go forward during this very difficult time. And I mean, we talk about this insurgence and this pandemic, but I think we would be remiss if we didn't also talk about heightened racial tensions, which were at the most explosive point when George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor died, and what that moment meant to this country. And so I think it's difficult to look at this moment in isolation. I think we really must afford a historical perspective on where we are and how we got here. And even if we look at just where we've been in the last year, we have, as a nation, and we're both living in North Carolina now, and as a state, and all states have really, really had quite a time and a challenge around how we go forward, around challenging norms and what justice looks like, whether we're talking about a pandemic and how the pandemic disproportionately impacts people, and even the distribution of the vaccine and how the pandemic is especially impacting people of color very differently. But the insurgence really was and has been, I think, for so many, a real exclamation point on where we are as a nation. And it was insulting to me and so many other Americans when I think about the fight for democracy, when I know that all of us deserve a republic that is fair and just, that there are people in my state and around this nation who are truly suffering and have no time for games to be played around their lives. And so I am deeply impacted by where we are at this moment and feel a real compulsion to think about how I might going forward be of service and really have been of service to folks in thinking about how best to make a contribution.
Well, your past service takes us right to the courts, where you've spent most of your career, and where Mr. Shah has spent most of his career litigating. And the impact of this period on the courts has been profound. This seems to be particularly important because for generations, the courts have served as a backstop and a really important place for recognizing and remedying discrimination. How are you thinking about the courts right now and their future?
Well, I'm so conscious of the fact that many of us, I for one, went into went to law school inspired by the paradigm of the law as an instrument for justice. It's a cliche, but on the top of the above the columns of the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., equal justice under law. However cynical one can be, at least that's the guiding principle with respect to law. And I know I was inspired by Brown versus Board of Education and the struggles that were led originally by the great Charles Hamilton Houston, who then mentored Thurgood Marshall, and Thurgood Marshall and the staff, the small staff of lawyers at the Legal Defense Fund that became a larger staff and connected with cooperating attorneys around the country and changed this country profoundly, or helped to change it. It wasn't all done through law. It was activists, and it was the civil rights movement writ large. But for me, law was a place to play a role in all of that. I have to say that I am conscious of how the law has its limitations. It certainly is not the primary instrument for social change. And yet, it is an instrument that I believe in. And there are times when it's the law, the courts, that have saved us in some respects from some of the ways in which we as a country tend to stray from our founding principles, as flawed as they were. So this is one of those moments. This is a moment in which we have to reclaim what we say we believe in. And I'm hopeful in this time that the courts will not stray too far, even though this is now the most conservative Supreme Court of my lifetime. One other thought, if I may, on this. I went to law school thinking about the federal courts. I think more and more about, state courts. Chief Justice Beasley served on the highest state court in North Carolina. And in many ways, those are the courts that are going to perhaps make a big difference in our everyday lives, individually and collectively. I wanted to underscore that because I want to underscore Chief Justice Beasley's service in the state courts as a judge, as a justice, and everything else that she has done, and whatever she will continue to do.
You know, I certainly care deeply about courts. I served as a judge for 22 years, 10 years on our trial court and 4 years on our intermediate appellate, and then 7 years on our Supreme Court and 2 years as Chief Justice. And certainly courts must be about promoting the rule of law. But the other piece of that is cases are not esoteric. Now, every case that comes before every single court is about somebody's life, which means something has happened, often not good things. And folks come to court expecting fair and just resolutions in their cases. And really, it's often in times like these where there are challenges and folks are feeling that there are injustices. And there are people like Ted Shaw and Charles Houston and so many others along the way who have demanded that justice, in fact, be equal. And that's how those cases not only get to our courts, but that's really how our society is moved forward. Often those court cases are fought hard and long for years. And often we see justice happen in that way. But sometimes justice is forced. And so that happens inside of our courts, and sometimes it happens outside of our courts as well. I am incredibly hopeful for courts. I think in the very same way that our nation has been impacted by by the pandemic and by heightened racial tensions around the deaths of so many, really. I think courts have necessarily had to recognize that justice lies within, that judges and justices and chief justices really have an obligation to be responsive and to recognize that there are disparities that happen within our courts, even under the best of intentions. If the outcomes are disparate, we really must look at empirical data to determine why that's happening. And number one, acknowledge that it's happening. I was so pleased that as dire, frankly, as the circumstances around George Floyd and others' deaths were. And I made a statement which was acknowledged in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal around that time about acknowledging racial and gender disparities in our courts, that so many court leaders were prepared to come along. And many of them in North Carolina and in other places said to me, I knew we should be doing something, I just didn't know what we should be doing. And so I'm very proud of the work that we've done in North Carolina. I'm very proud of the fact that we have in place a Commission on Fairness and Equity, which really institutes benchmarks about how our North Carolina's courts must operate differently and really think differently about what fairness is and must be. And we're talking today about criminal justice, but I think it's important to be mindful that those rules and the rule of law really must apply in the same way around civil justice cases as well, as we think about people who in the middle of a pandemic are losing their housing and being evicted, as we think about issues around family law and custody and juvenile law and young people being incarcerated. So it's important that we holistically be thinking about courts, systems as a whole. And I agree with Professor Shaw that the federal courts are deeply important, but often the state courts are making decisions about people's everyday lives, even at the same time or sometimes singularly. And folks don't even really know it. And so it is so important to be in tune with what's happening with state courts and realizing the importance of the role of justices there as well.
I brought you all together in the hopes that you would ask questions of each other. So if it's okay with you, Mr. Shaw, I'm going to give you an opportunity and hopefully let you all kind of take the lead here so that I get to listen, which was my whole plan. And I'll jump in with some questions as they come in from the audience as the opportunity presents.
Well, thank you so much. And I think where I want to start is with an acknowledgement that during this pandemic, business as usual was not possible. There's some silver linings, perhaps, in this time that we're in. So, for example, I think the Chief Justice, I'd like to hear her. I'd like to hear you. Let me just turn to you, Chief Justice Beasley. I want to hear you talk about what you saw that had to be done differently. It was important to, for example, release some people who were incarcerated pursuant to the criminal justice system. That was a necessity. I'd love to hear you talk about that. And I don't know how much pushback there was on doing that, but I'd like to hear about that also, if there was, and how you dealt with that. You were overseeing this completely challenged judicial system in North Carolina, as all of our states were challenged. But you were sitting in the seat where you were overseeing the North Carolina judiciary. So are there any silver linings? Were there any opportunities to do things that otherwise wouldn't happen? And where do you see us heading?
There really have been a host of silver linings. I was the first Chief Justice in the nation to enter an order reducing greatly the number of cases we were hearing in our courts. And in my mind, paramount had to have been safety, that we really needed to think about the fact that on a daily basis, there were thousands of people being called to our courts across the state. And in a pandemic with a highly contagious disease, we just needed to think differently about how we were holding court. And you're right, local officials, to include sheriffs, were making decisions about especially releasing inmates from jail. And, maybe there was some pushback, but I think we all realized that the paradigm shifted quickly. The court system in North Carolina and very few courts were prepared for this kind of stopgap in our operations, but we all needed to adjust quickly. And everybody really did. I mean, there really was very little pushback. And folks did realize that there were some folks who needed to be released. And so as you ask about what were some of the benefits, as a part of that, I think it's important to realize that there were some folks who were incarcerated who probably shouldn't have been incarcerated in the first place. And so to be able to think about things differently in that way was what has been hugely important. We were in a pandemic, but there were some things we were trying to get done anyway, to include reducing mass debt relief. If somebody comes to court and is asked to pay $400 in the cost of court for a minor offense, and those fines and fees snowball over the years. One's license is revoked for 1 year, 10 years, 15 years. And so we were doing that kind of thing anyway, and ended up relieving hundreds of thousands of debt in that way, but also thinking about how not to go back to those situations. The judges have a lot of control and authority over how and whether to impose fines and fees and to what extent. And so it's really important for an independent judiciary for judges to be able to do that. In North Carolina, we had just signed a contract to improve our technology. I will tell the world we are still using MS-DOS systems, which is a very antiquated 40-year-old system, and it's but we are well on our way. But little did we know that we could be holding hearings virtually and doing a whole lot of things. And so we know that in some of the smaller counties where the courthouse may be 20 miles away, rather than people coming to the courthouse, even after the pandemic, it just makes so much more sense to do as much virtually as possible. And so in so many ways, we are efficient. And so I think there are a host of ways in which there have been improvements around thinking about not just incarceration, and remember the prison system is a different system. And so I had no authority over that. And there has been conflict and litigation about whether or not and to what extent inmates should be released from the North Carolina prison systems. But there have been mass improvements, even though there have also been delays in hearing cases. And that's part of what happens when you have districts, even though we have a unified court system in North Carolina, but there are some districts that don't have broadband. And so as we move to try to increase and improve those systems, those courts weren't able to operate under the same kind of systems in some of the larger areas.
Of course, you pointed. Well, go ahead and let me.
I was just going to say, I think it really forced the court system to think very deeply about how to meet the needs of the public. And I'm glad that the courts and we were able to do that in a really constructive way.
Well, I was thinking, and you pointed out the system of incarceration, that's a separate track or separate system. However, I've been so conscious that the ways in which we have lived during this pandemic have changed our lives. We're doing what we're doing right now on Zoom. People are conducting most of their business now without the kind of traveling that was done before. And I suspect that even after we're by this pandemic, with the grace of God, we hope that it's soon. Even after that, some of the changes are going to remain in place. And it's the way we're going to do business for a number of different reasons. Having said that, I remember a deep discomfort I felt when I first started hearing about parole hearings across the country being conducted virtually, where the incarcerated prisoner, the incarcerated person, never sees the parole board or the individuals who are making these decisions face to face. I thought that made a difference. I was uncomfortable with that. I'm not sure that I want all these things to be done at that distance. There's some things where it makes a difference. And so I don't know whether the world that we will live in after the pandemic is over is one that I want to be completely changed by the way we've lived in the last year. Any thoughts on that?
Well, certainly as we think about disparities, I think that's a critical issue. And often, I think about when Johnny comes to court with a lawyer in a suit and their pastor, parents, and support system, that Johnny may receive a different kind of justice than Johnny who may be incarcerated. Family doesn't show up, pastor doesn't, or clergy person doesn't show up, and how all of us view the Johnnies differently. And so we know that in some jurisdictions across the nation, actually trials are being held. And so when you think about what that means in terms of being able to actually be in the presence of physically of a witness and those kinds of things, what it means to especially criminal defendants, is that true justice? But it also means, criminal defendants being brought over from the jail for bond hearings, or all those happening virtually or telephonically. And that had been happening actually before the pandemic in a lot of counties. And so I think it is always important to be mindful of what that space looks like, whether people actually physically in courtrooms or in places where decisions are being made about their lives, and do they fully understand and have the opportunity to fully engage so that they understand what is happening, and also to be able to fully participate in the process. So I think you raise a real question there about that, and I wonder, as one who leads students in these kinds of thought processes, what the dialogue in your classes might have been like around those kinds of issues.
Well, the dialogue during times of pandemic has changed both substantively and also the process. I think we both gain some things and lose some things. So, for example, when I teach now, I've been teaching virtually all my classes, and I'm an African American man of a certain age, with some of the classic conditions health-wise of many people in the Black community. We talk about, as I started to say, as some of the old folks say, but I'm one of them now, having the pressure and the sugar, high blood pressure and diabetes. And I mention that because I'm not going to teach in person until we're by this pandemic. There are some ways in which my interactions with students by Zoom is surprisingly at close quarters in ways that it might not have been if I was in a classroom now with a mask on and socially distanced. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to teach the way we teach. Substantively, I think students are a lot more stressed and pressed these days about what jobs are going to be available, what this period of time during legal education during the pandemic is going to mean, and how it will carry over into their professional lives. But the other thing that students are terribly conscious about are the racial tensions over the last year that coincided, more than the last year, but that have coincided with the pandemic. You mentioned George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and once we start calling names, it's hard to stop. I think about that young man. I can't even recall where he was. It might have been in Kentucky. Who every time I see his face, every time I hear his name, here was a young man on his way home and who was wearing a mask and was stopped by the police, and he told them, "I'm a little different, but I'm not getting in any trouble. I'm not doing anything wrong." He ended up losing his life. It breaks my heart every time I think about that young man. But as it should for all of these people who have died wrongly. Students now are asking questions as never before about our judicial system, about our system of law enforcement, about our system of criminal justice. And it's very different from the time when I was a law student, or even most of the years in which I practiced law as somebody who was fighting against racial discrimination. This is a time that in some ways is different than any other time, I would say, in my personal life, but also my life as a lawyer. I am so I'm so grateful for the higher level of consciousness that students have, because they're challenging us. They're challenging the law professors, challenging the administrators, they're challenging the universities. I think that that's healthy and good. So I'm hopeful.
That's huge. That's really huge.
So I did not expect to break in this early, but we have so many questions in the box that I almost feel an obligation to on behalf of the immense audience. And so let me actually, if I may, go back to something that Chief Justice Beasley mentioned, which is the fines and fees cycle, because that cycle, I think, is representative of one of the ways that disparities persist in the system, right? You get these kind of chain reaction events that you can't figure out exactly where and how to break them. So you have someone who is poor and gets fees and then can't pay and then gets a warrant and then gets a driver's license suspension and new charges. And the whole thing kind of builds on itself. Can you talk a little bit about targeting and what you see as the way to kind of break some of these cycles, and maybe in particular the fines and fees cycle?
I think we have to commit ourselves to knowing more. And I think it's important for court leaders to know more. I think it's not enough to have persons show up in court and see that there are all of these fines and fees and assume that the person hasn't been compliant just because they just didn't want to. I think if we just think logically about it, if one is sent to court and ordered to pay $400 and the cost of court, and those fines and fees snowball, for most folks to think about trying to catch up those kind of fines and fees, it would be quite a challenge. And to expect anybody to do that and to not have some understanding and empathy for the impact of not having a driver's license or whatever the other sanction is on their lives, and not to make the effort to understand it, really it causes an injustice. And so we really, number one, must acknowledge that the fines and fees, especially in the aggregate, are not fair. And the Supreme Court of the United States tells the lower courts that they must determine the ability to pay, and that needs to be happening at every single hearing. And I'm not sure that it is, and I'm just not sure that court leaders always think about it in that way. But it really is imperative that it happens. And so these are not single person issues or single court official issues. These really are court systemic issues, and which means the solutions lie within the systems. And it really is important, really from the top down, for courts to be responsive, to do the homework to determine why it's happening and the impact, and then to offer solutions around it. But once there's a desire to do it, in North Carolina, I'm not the Chief Justice any longer, so I can't tell you what's going to happen going forward, but I can tell you that when I was the Chief Justice, we made a concerted effort to alleviate the debt and to relieve it. It was the right thing to do. And the other piece of that is, in certain areas of the state, we realized that disparately, Black men were being stopped. And so we were looking at who was being fined, how much they were being fined, who was being greatly impacted, and how it was really important to offer that relief. And so it's important to do that on the back end, but it's even more important to do that on the front end. We should not be imposing those kinds of fines and fees that really obstruct people's lives. That should not be the point. And so we just have to be more thoughtful about all that.
That was, of course, that was Ferguson. But Ferguson was also many communities throughout the country in which disproportionately Black and brown people were being saddled with these these debts, these fines and fees, most of which arose out of fairly insignificant interactions with law enforcement. But look what it led to in Ferguson, and look what it did to erode trust in the relationship between African Americans and law enforcement. And so it's absolutely right. We have to revisit these fines and fees. And there's something else that's connected to this that I'm conscious about, that I want to lift up. We're talking about the criminal justice system, but one of the collateral effects, of course, is the ability to participate in the democratic processes. And one of the things that we're facing in the aftermath of the last election season, and frankly, the assault on the ability of Black and brown people to participate in the political process. Many of them disproportionately frozen out of that process because of the disproportionate felony conviction statistics that characterize many of the states and our communities around the country. But there's a whole new raft of legislation that some legislatures are looking at now, which are aimed at explicitly denying people the right to vote for political and partisan reasons. And so my concern is that I think we're going to see more, not less, in the way of attempts to freeze people out of political processes and deny the right to vote. And if that happens, it's going to be one of the things that will only deepen the divisions in our country that trouble us so much now and have characterized our interactions as Americans over the last 4 years.
I would just add that Professor Shaw is right. I think there are over 160 pieces of legislation in state legislatures to curtail the right to vote for people of color. So we've got to all be mindful. I know there are a lot of lawyers here today, but a lot of people who are just interested in care. And we've got to be deeply engaged in understanding the right to vote and what it means and what it symbolizes, and the ability to engage, and the fact that when people are foreclosed from voting, it completely puts them on the fringes of our society. And if we truly believe in equal justice for all, that just cannot be.
One of the pieces that I think relates to some of the things you were talking about releasing people from jail during the pandemic and whether they ever should have been there to start with, raises a question in general about how to start tackling mass incarceration, and tackling it, both the inflow and the people who are already there. And I guess on a very broad kind of starter place, I'm wondering if you have just an idea of the top kind of 3 things or 2 or less where you would start as a way of trying to roll back mass incarceration in this country.
I think it's really important to, and we had already begun to do this in North Carolina, to first of all acknowledge racial disparities. That's a huge thing. And I think often white people assume that it's easier for Black people and people of color to talk about race, and it often really is not. And so it really is important, number one, to acknowledge that there are disparities. And it's important to acknowledge and to do the empirical data, because it's more than what I feel like, and it's more than I see what's happening in various communities. I mean, the data reveals and shows that there's a disproportionate impact in communities of color. So the data shows that, and it's just important to really have not just court community conversations, but a court commitment to make change. And those are very difficult but constructive conversations and actions that can happen, that at least started to happen in North Carolina. And they really can happen, but there really has to be a long-term commitment. And it's not about making people comfortable. It's about facing some very difficult and awful truths about the history of race in North Carolina and around the nation, frankly. And realizing that everybody has a responsibility, whether we're talking about courts or any other institution, to figure out how best to address the disparities.
One of the things that I want to lift up is the ways in which over the last decade or so, more and more people have become aware of the racial injustice, the disparities with respect to the criminal justice system. And a lot of it is driven by, or has been driven by, drug policy. There are a lot of people who resist this when they hear it. The Bureau of Justice statistics that the Justice Department keeps plays this out in very stark terms. Black people don't use drugs in higher proportions than white people. Many people are invested in denying that. They refuse to believe it. And over the last 5 or 6 years, or maybe more, we've seen how many white people have been caught up in addictions that could just as easily lead to the levels of mass incarceration that have characterized Black and brown people in this country. For the most part, it hasn't, though. Now we see people talking about alternative treatments to incarceration. I'm glad that that discourse has taken place. But in the meantime, there are still hundreds of thousands of Black and brown people who remain incarcerated for fairly low-level and nonviolent drug offenses, including marijuana offenses in a lot of jurisdictions. So there's a great deal of work that has yet to be done with respect to eliminating racial disparities in arrests, in charging, in prosecution, and convictions, and in sentencing. That has to remain a priority among those who are concerned about criminal justice.
A bunch of questions have come through about bail reform and the bail process. And one of them goes directly to North Carolina. And it concerns legal representation at first appearance when bail is initially set, and whether that constitutional right to counsel will ever be fully enforced at that very initial phase. It's a problem across the country, and whether you think that's kind of critical to get in at that very early phase of trying to combat the disparate impact of bail itself.
It is very important. And we have pilot programs for setting pretrial release conditions in the western and eastern parts of the state, both of which are very, very rural. And those programs have been very successful in guaranteeing that folks can make it back to court with little or no bond, mostly no bond, and that in the western part of the state, a counsel had been assigned at those initial periods. And so we could see the difference. I have to say that in those areas tend to be predominantly white, but it's been a great experiment to determine how best to set bond. And I'm hopeful that those programs will be expansive across the state. I don't know, but I hope that it will. But it really is critical that all litigants criminally charged have counsel from the beginning of the process through the process. And at any point when that's not happening, it really does create a great risk of whether or not one's rights are actually being protected. I would want to say this too. We keep talking about racial disparities, and I think it's really important to do that. But I think it's also to be mindful that there are gender disparities as well. And it's important for us to be thoughtful that whether we're talking about criminal justice or civil justice, and those issues are very real, and a lot of folks who have unmet legal needs in that area. There are great gender disparities, especially when you think about family law, juvenile law, housing issues. And I mean, when you have lots of women who are heading their households, they are often disparately impacted by those issues, as well as civil fines and fees as well.
I'm assuming there are other questions, but in this moment of silence, all I can say is agreed. And in addition to that, I'm conscious of the ways in which poverty impacts people's interactions with the legal system, both with respect to the civil system, but also with respect to criminal law.
There's a question about positive change. You both have been at this for quite some time. And the question is, what have been some of the biggest changes you've experienced that you've been in your respective positions? And what changes have you been a part of that you're most proud of?
Well, I think the changes that that I am conscious of are changes that have impacted a higher level of consciousness with respect to the criminal justice system and this so-called war on drugs. I think that more people understand now that the way the criminal justice system has operated with respect to this so-called war on drugs just hasn't made a lot of sense. That we need to treat people's addictions as a problem that's addressed outside of incarceration. Now, I'm not saying that people who are violent don't need to put it this way. They don't need time out. Some people need to be taken out of society for a period of time, and I hope rehabilitated. But I think more and more people are aware of the fact that our so-called war on drugs isn't working. The other thing that I'm very hopeful about that has been changing and is changing has to do with the imposition of the penalties at the highest rung of the criminal justice system, and that's capital punishment. I think, I hope that more and more people are aware of the problematic aspects of capital punishment. More states are turning away from executions, or they're executing fewer people, and more states understand the ways in which people who are subjected to capital punishment often, there's the Innocence Project. There are projects in which now with DNA evidence, we know that people make mistakes, juries make mistakes, and we have to change the way this whole system of capital punishment has been implemented, quite aside from, but including the racial discrimination that has occurred in the capital punishment system. So those are things that I think have changed and are changing in ways that I am hopeful about. But I also have reasons to be perhaps less sanguine about what's going on, and that has to do with the ways in which I think our system of law and our judicial system remains tainted by racial inequity. That hasn't changed, and I'm deeply concerned about what has happened over the last several years and the ways in which we have yet to, I think, change the jurisprudence to address the inequities along lines of race.
You know, I think out of challenges come opportunities for us to be forced to do things better and to do things differently. And I believe that we had begun to think about the impact of mental health and mental illness differently. And I think this pandemic, frankly, compounded by heightened racial tensions and more, will also cause us to think about mental health differently and to think about its impact on what is often looked at as criminal behavior when it's really mental illness at play. And I think we'll be forced to do it when there are folks who have suffered greatly, whether it's from substance abuse or domestic violence or child abuse, and all those numbers are up in the pandemic, as is child hunger. But there's a mental health impact to all that. So treatment and those other kinds of things will be hugely important, but mental health and the recognition of the impact of mental illness will be hugely important. And I think we had already begun to see that systems understand that mental health and mental illness is real. I think also the improvements on juvenile justice. In North Carolina, we were the last state in the nation to raise the age of when a child could be charged as a juvenile as opposed to an adult. But along with that came lots of programs which looked at the child as indeed a child, and where there are issues of hunger. In North Carolina, 1 in 5 children was hungry before the pandemic, and in the pandemic, 1 in 3 is hungry. And so, looking at children holistically and giving them and providing justice solutions to give them a better chance to be successful, I think those are real benefits from knowing more and learning more, but also from tough times like the pandemic.
I am very cognizant of the fact that I am sitting here as a white woman asking questions about racial disparities. And that makes me want to at least ask you about some of the pressures of being a Black leader on these issues. I feel like from observing that there are often pressures to lead, but simultaneously pressures not to look too adamant or outspoken. And I'm wondering if you can address that and how it has manifested, and quite candidly, if you think that is an improving situation.
Well, I certainly find myself talking about race a whole lot these days. And I don't know that I wasn't talking about it before, but the forums in which I'm talking about them have certainly increased drastically. That there are law firms and corporations and all of these entities who want to do better and know more. And while I don't consider myself a teacher, and I certainly don't feel the obligation to teach, it is important to have conversations and to speak openly and honestly about the impact of race and racism. And I have been doing that. It is, the context in which I'm having these conversations differ. And I'm often not talking about happy things. I mean, there are some bad things happening these days, and it is indeed troubling. I will tell you, when I was the Chief Justice, I was interviewed by a journalist who asked me, after I spoke out and made a public statement about the racial disparities and the outcry in North Carolina and around the nation following the death of George Floyd and others, if I was an activist. And I was very clear that I was the Chief Justice and not an activist. And that was really important, that as the leader of the judicial system in North Carolina, that the Chief Justice acknowledged that there are racial disparities. And as the Chief Justice, I could ill afford to point fingers externally, that we really needed to work on what was happening in our court system. And so people are uncomfortable talking about race, and often folks want to talk about it in the context in which they want to talk about it. And when that's not an option, if you ask me to speak, because we have to look at the way we talk about race and the impact of racism, and the impact of racial disparities and gender disparities in the context of a whole lot of things. And it does make it uncomfortable. But I don't think about whether or not my words are threatening. It's certainly not my intention to be threatening, but it is important to me to have open and honest discourse about a very, very difficult, and I don't even really want to call it a topic, because when it becomes a way of life, it feels like more than a topic to me and those who are experiencing racism. It doesn't feel like a topic, right? But it is important for us to engage and to be committed. And the only way to be committed, truly committed, is to feel uncomfortable sometimes, to have conversations that always don't feel great, but to be committed to moving forward and to changing the way we do things, and to changing our society, to making things better for folks who are feeling and experiencing those disparities.
You know, I was, as I was listening to you, I was thinking about how for so long, I've been at the bar now for I think a little over 40 years, and for so long doing anti-discrimination work, so many people denied that race was even a real thing, a real factor, a real phenomenon. There was a lot of gaslighting going on. Maybe this goes back to one of the earlier questions about what's changed. Ironically, what's changed for the better in part is the inability now, I think, in this particular moment, to deny that we still have work to do with respect to race. We're not in a colorblind society. We haven't gotten there. And I think that that's not a bad thing, that we can't deny that right now. And my hope is that that leads to more constructive engagement on issues of race and inequality. And as you correctly point out, gender. I think we have to talk about these things and more in our interactions as the people of this country, and certainly those of us who are engaged in the practice of law.
I think that naturally kind of leads us to a question about representation and diversity, not just of race and gender, but of background. There's been a lot of conversation about the overrepresentation of prosecutors among judges, or the underrepresentation of civil rights lawyers and public defenders. In addition, a Brennan Center update of a report on judicial diversity showed that 23 of our states currently have all white state Supreme Courts, including 12 states where people of color make up at least 20% of the population. I wonder if you can talk about the importance of representation, and again, whether you think that's critical to having more conversations about race and combating racial disparities.
Well, that Brennan report statistic that you just cited is a stunning statistic in these days, although for some people, they find that perhaps unremarkable. But I like to think, as many other Americans think, that we are long past the point where in states where you have significant Black and brown and Asian American and indigenous people populations, that anything in the criminal justice system, especially the judges who adjudicate the issues that are brought to our court system, whether it's criminal justice or whether it's civil, that anything can be all white or it's acceptable for that these days. I don't think it is. Some people apparently think otherwise, but I think that we are at a point in our country where we either see diversity as a strength, and we strive to see that we have representation on the bench and in all of our institutions, or we're going to see racial divisions, continue to find their way out into the streets and into other manifestations in our country that are not constructive. To find their way out in ways that are destructive. I think that's a challenge we have. And for those who are still trying to hold on to that old America, the white supremacy America, the reality is that you can do what you want, but those days are over. It was never America, but it's not going to be America as our demographics continue to change. And we're better for inclusiveness. And that's become a central part of what the legal profession is about and does, but of all of our institutions, whether we're talking about the military, whether we're talking about corporate America, whether we're talking about educational institutions, we need to be inclusive.
At the end of last year, there were 7 African Americans serving as a Chief Justice in the United States and her territories. There are 2 of us who left the bench at the end of last year. The other is Chief Justice Burnett Johnson, who was the Chief Justice of the Louisiana Supreme Court. At the end of last year, we were the only 2 African-American women, which means that this year there are no African-American women serving as Chief Justices of any Supreme Court. When I was on our Supreme Court, we had the most diverse Supreme Court in the nation with 3 African-Americans, 3 women, and the first Jewish member of the court in 200 years. He, in addition to me, we both lost our elections last year. And so diversity matters. Diversity engenders trust in institutions and courts, in governmental institutions and corporations. And the converse of that is when there is not diversity, it almost feels like there is a concerted effort to exclude. And it really is easy to include. And so when there is no diversity, people believe that there's a reason for that. And so all of our institutions, whether we're talking about courts or corporations or governmental institutions or every other facet of our lives, really must be diverse if we really want true equality. If we really want people to believe and to trust in who we are as a nation and as a democracy, we absolutely must have diversity. And enough of us yearn it we really ought to have it everywhere.
Yeah, I can't help but uh, mention that, um, Chief Justice Beasley is right. When she was Chief Justice and when she was on the bench, uh, it was the most diverse state Supreme Court in the country. There were, in my view, and this is just me speaking, but I don't mind saying it, there were dog whistle politics as a consequence of that change on the court. North Carolina, as much as I love this state, and while I didn't grow up in North Carolina, I have deep, deep roots in North Carolina. My ancestors, were North Carolinians, many of them, and also some Virginians, but some of them labored as enslaved people. Some of them, and I don't claim it with pride, were enslavers, but that's the way our country's history plays out in our demographics. But North Carolina still has some ways to go. Just because we make progress in one moment doesn't mean that we're not going to see retrenchment. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 1 step back. Sometimes it's 1 step forward and 2 steps back. But we still have a long way to go to make North Carolina what it ought to be. And I'm thankful to Chief Justice Beasley for her service on the bench. And I hope that, and I'm sure that her service to North Carolina hasn't ended yet.
I want to pick up on that point because I think there's an increasing sense, and it goes to the election of judges among many other people, that recognition of racism itself has become politicized. And that many of the fights that we're seeing, and I think it was very true in Chief Justice Beasley's race, are about willingness to address racism itself, and whether that should be part of the role. How do we get past the politicization of a willingness to acknowledge racism?
Well, that's a tough question, obviously, because some people know that that dog whistle racism still works, both on the state and local level, but also on the national level. Anybody who says that the last presidential administration didn't play the politics of race in all that it was doing, both to get elected, but also to in the attempt to get reelected, isn't being intellectually honest. So some people, sadly, some of this stuff still works. That's the problem. I think the answer to the question you're posing is one for which individuals bear responsibility as individuals, and have to ask whether that stuff works with me, or whether I reject the politics of dog whistle racism or open racism. Some of this stuff wasn't dog whistle. Some of it was just, there were sirens going off and being set off. So look, I don't mean to be in any way, pessimistic or to be cynical. We live in a country that now, unlike what I ever thought I would see, has twice elected an African American as president. and that has elected a woman who has both African American blood in her and the blood of an Indian parent from India in this country. That's extraordinary. And it is undoubtedly progress. We have seen a great deal of progress and we continue to see it, but it is also true that the election of a president who was openly courting racism and was racist himself occurred not in spite of the election twice of an African American president, but because of that election. And so, as I said, we're still very much engaged in this fight for fairness. But what is possible in this country is different than what was ever possible before. But we can't be sanguine. We can't rest. We have to continue to fight against our worst instincts. And we have to fight to lift up our best instincts as a country. And when I say fight, I don't mean it the way some people use it to go to the Capitol on January 6th. I mean it in the best sense of the word. John Lewis is talking about good trouble, necessary trouble. The fight for racial justice, which is not the same thing as what happened on January 6th. It's not comparable.
I agree that we really must continue to fight and we must continue to persevere. And, with all challenges, those challenges lead to perseverance and perseverance to hope. That's actually biblical scripture. And we have an obligation, if we really, really care about eradicating racism, and if we really, really, really care about equal justice for all people, we absolutely must not be passive. All of us understand and we see what's happening in this nation every single day. And every one of us, regardless of whether we're an elected official or not, has an obligation to stand up and tell the truth and to change the world around us in our own way. I mean, all of us need to be in service in our own bailiwicks. And all of us, when we see racism or we see discrimination happening to somebody around us, if we just stand around and say and do nothing and become victims ourselves, then the insurgents win. And we can ill afford to have that to happen. If we care about this country and we care about our children's children's children, and we care about leaving a better place for them, we must stand up and we must stand up for the truth.
It may feel like a little bit of a turn, but I would be remiss. There are about 15 questions that all relate to policing. And I think it goes, actually, Chief Justice Beasley, to kind of how you answered the fines and fees cycle, which was to say you got to stop it where it starts and address it right at the point where you're setting the fine and considerability to pay, and then address it all along. But could you each address your kind of current thinking on this current moment we're having with increased scrutiny of policing, the question of whether to defund the police, and there are some questions that really raise the historical origins of policing in this country as one of the reasons that a dramatic rethinking of policing might be more in order than kind of reforms around the edges or just budget cuts. Mr. Shaw, can I start with you?
Sure. There's so much in there. There are ways in which policing in this country and the way policing has been carried out is rooted in our history of slavery, of racism, particularly when we talk about relationships between law enforcement and Black and brown communities. A lot of people either aren't aware of that or in denial of that. When we think about the 19th century, the post slavery era, the Reconstruction era, and the ways in which policing was done was heavily entwined with how law enforcement treated Black people and subordinated them. In the 20th century, the same thing is true. Go back and look at mid-20th century America's great study in American Dilemma, overseen by Gunnar Myrdal, the Swedish sociologist. And if you go and look in an American Dilemma, you'll see the ways in which racial violence usually stem from an interaction between law enforcement and Black people, usually Black men. But it's true with respect to the 1919 race riot in Chicago. It's true with respect to what was called race riots in 1943, but also in the 1960s, again and again. It's these interactions between law enforcement and Black men, usually, and sometimes Black women, that led to these eruptions, these rebellions in cities where Black people found themselves hopeless with respect to being treated as basic human beings. So all of that remains true. And then here we are in the 21st century, and it's still true. All these, all of us, I think, or many of us keep saying when these shootings happen, these police killings, again, how does this keep happening? And for a long time, people were in denial about it. Well, you can't be in denial now because of cell phone video cameras and the fact that we're all on or being recorded no matter where we are. And so it's hard for people to gaslight and engage in denial, but we still see these interactions between the police, law enforcement, and Black people. And often law enforcement is being treated or treats Black communities as if they are occupation forces in those communities. Now, I say that understanding both the necessity of law enforcement being able to do a job. And I also am conscious of the fact that it's a difficult and dangerous job. People who call for defunding the police, I would let them speak for themselves. I think that I don't think we've gotten to the point where we don't need police departments. But we don't need police departments to police the way they have been doing these jobs. And we need to treat the communities in which Black and brown people live with the same respect that other communities are accorded. And we need to abandon this so-called war on drugs. It's a war on Black and brown people. You don't fight wars on inanimate objects or things. And so you fight wars against people, and it's been against Black and brown people, while white people many white people use drugs, they're not treated the same way. So all of that has to change with respect to policing. And I think also we need to change priorities. We need to put more into how police are trained to interact with people who have mental health problems, as Chief Justice Beasley mentioned earlier, because Those problems are ubiquitous throughout all communities. I can go on and on about this. We need to fundamentally redefine how policing is done in this country, and we need to do some shifting with respect to the prioritization of the kinds of training that law enforcement officers have. And finally, I'll just throw this in here also. We need to have more policing done by people who both look like and are the people who live in the communities that are being policed. That's back to that old that occupational force thing that I was referencing. We need a whole lot of change, and there is change underway. You asked about change earlier. We need to rethink the jurisprudence that has governed how policing is treated. And some of that is happening now. We're revisiting some of the doctrines that have governed how police officers are protected by qualified immunity. That's long overdue. And we need to also revisit how law enforcement has the police unions have protected police officers who have engaged in misconduct. Some of that is beginning to happen. We need more of it.
Policing really must be grounded in humanity, and I'll just pick up a little bit where Professor Shaw left off in that, when something happens, there always appears to be this adversarial process. And so it's the goal is never to get to the truth of what happened. The goal is to figure out how to protect and conceal. And it really is important, really, before something happens, to be having conversations and setting policy around what policing ought to look like. I'm thankful that the governor of North Carolina has really focused a lot through his Criminal Justice Commission on that. But I also know that as we have heard so much about defunding the police, and there's something about that language that just doesn't really quite sit right. Defunding the police is not going to happen. We need folks who are charged with the authority to keep, and I hate to use the term law and order, but law and order in our communities, and we trust that those systems are going to be fair and just. The issue is when they're not. That there really has to be something in place, and I do think we have to be mindful of the history of policing in this nation, because trust is a real factor. And it really can't be us versus them, because there is no trust in that, which means that neither side or policing or community folks and leaders can't really be effective in determining how best to find solutions for making sure that, number one, these incidents don't happen, but number two, when they do happen, that there's really honest and open investigations as to what's happening. And for there to be community trust, there has to be community involvement openly, and true transparency around what these processes are and what's happening in them.
I want to, I'm very cognizant of your time, and we are almost at an end, but there is a question from a 1L who asks, do the speakers have any thoughts on the best way for young people and emerging lawyers to focus our energy in terms of combating racial injustice? Public defender, employment discrimination, voting rights, housing, of course, all crucial, but is there a specific area that you would say would most benefit from an influx of young lawyers?
I can't choose one. I think all of that and more. We need good people and prosecutors. Mm-hmm. There's a story I often tell, but time won't permit me to. I won't take it now. About diversity in prosecutors' office. That's what it's about at the end of the day. So when I came out of law school, I knew I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. I'm glad I did what I did, but I used to think about, the good guys and the bad guys, so to speak. But we need people who are committed to being engaged in prosecution activities that are non-discriminatory, that are non-racist, that that really are aiming to do justice. And so I don't discourage people from going into prosecutors' offices. But yes, we need people to do housing discrimination work or anti-discrimination work. We need people who are willing to do employment discrimination litigation or employment discrimination. We need people to work for those who are trying to protect women from abuse. We need people to do all the kinds of work that is necessary to protect political participation and voting rights. There's no end to the work that needs to be done across the board. I didn't mention LGBTQ people and the issues that are necessary to address with respect to their rights. All of that and more. There's no end to what we need young people to do. Just choose your course, commit to it, and make a positive contribution. And work for fairness and equity and equality. You don't need somebody like me to tell you what to do. You probably wouldn't take it anyway and shouldn't. But figure out what's important to you that's valuable and has integrity, and then do it.
I agree with Professor Shaw. If you are a law student and you will be a lawyer, which is so exciting, you have an opportunity to be a vessel, and you can change and shape the course of the profession and our communities in any way you see fit. And so there are a wealth of opportunities in every single segment of our society. And it's really young people who often push us forward, who push the profession forward, who create new areas of practice of the law. And you have an opportunity to create, but also to be vigilant in pushing forward non-discriminatory practices and assuring that there are diverse people around you and diverse practices happening.
Well, I just want to thank you both so much. This was truly a dream come true for me. And I want to thank our audience for joining us for this free webinar. We want to express just enormous gratefulness for the work that you both do, and the work that you will continue to do, and for taking your time from your busy schedules today to share with us. I have to thank again the generous supporter of this program, Melanie Bates Consulting. The section for Civil Rights and Social Justice of the ABA provides free webinars and resources for legal professionals and advocates nationwide. We really hope that this helps you in the work that you do. And again, if you can, please consider becoming active in the ABA. Check us out at ambar.org/CRSJ, and you can find more information on other free programs on our website. Best of luck to everyone, and please stay safe in your community.
Thanks.